Welcome to This Week in X. This is the show where I help you get caught up with all of the X-Men comics out from Marvel this week on the 7th of March 2018. It's not quite a recap, although I do help you figure out where the book is currently standing and how to catch up with it. And it's not quite a review, although I'm definitely going to share my feelings about the book and if I think it's the quality of book that you might enjoy. We've got 5 issues out from Marvel with X-Men characters in them this week, including Iceman issue 11, which is the final issue of this Iceman series, Rogue and Gambit issue 3 of 5, Venom issue 163, which features the X-Men Blue Team in the final chapter of the Poison X crossover, X-Men Gold number 23, and X-Men Red issue number 2. I also usually cover X-Men collected editions on the show, but there are no new collected editions featuring X-Men out this week from Marvel, so let's get right down to taking a look at the new issues. First up this week is Iceman issue number 11, which is the final issue of the Sina Grace scripted Iceman series. Iceman number 11 was written by Sina Grace with art from Robert Gill, along with Sina Grace. The credits at the end lead us to believe that he is the inker. There's also color art by Rachel Rosenberg, letters from Joe Sabino, and a cover by Kevin Wada. It feels a little bit strange to just recap 10 issues in an 11-issue series to you, so instead, let me help you get caught up to how this series happened and frame it for you a little bit. So Iceman has for a long time been one of the regular members of an X-Men squad at any given time, and that certainly was the case in Marvel Now and in the beginning of All New, All Different Marvel starting at the end of 2015. The thing that changed is during Marvel Now, which is the period after Avengers vs. X-Men that began in 2013, we had a second Iceman. This was a teen Iceman who was brought back with all of the original teen X-Men as part of Brian Bendis' all-new X-Men title. So these were X-Men taken from the first few issues of X-Men from 1963 and brought to the present day by Beast in some kind of attempt to kind of convince the X-Men, primarily Scott Summers' Cyclops, that the team had really gone on the wrong track in the recent history, but it turns out Beast can't send them back. So these heroes have a lot of adventures, and this book, this current Iceman book, does not star that teen Iceman. So why am I talking about it? Well, at the end of that series, Brian Bendis had Jean Grey do a little bit of psychic poking around in teen Iceman's head, and revealed to himself, even though I guess he already knew, that he was gay. And so it was kind of a forced coming out, but just between the two of them. Jean did not expose his secret to other people, and Iceman does decide for himself that he does want to come out to the other X-Men, which includes, weirdly, coming out to the older version of himself, who canonically on the page has been shown to have had many female partners over the year, but also canonically on the page has been shown to have some doubts about his identity and relationships, has been seeded in since the 90s. So in All New, All Different Marvel, we have this adult Iceman who is gay Iceman for the first time, outwardly, openly gay, but he's primarily starring in Extraordinary X-Men written by Jeff Lemire, and there's not a whole lot of room to explore this new side of Iceman that's kind of just been dropped on us, and then Marvel Now kind of just ended right after that. So there wasn't a lot of chance to explore it. So this Iceman series takes Iceman and lets him go through a little bit of the process, not necessarily of just coming out, but coming to terms of what it means for him to be out, and also a superhero and what that means for his role in the X-Men and amongst his friends. So we've seen a lot of a journey in this series. We've seen him speaking with his parents, coming out to his parents. We've seen him sharing time with Kitty Pryde, who is one of his former partners, and also going to LA to spend some time with his Champions teammates, and then finally facing off in 2 different situations against Wolverine's son, Daken. This issue doesn't really need any of that to make sense. In fact, I would say that if you have been waffling about if you're interested in the Iceman series at all, you could pick up this issue, the final issue, and just decide if it seems appealing to you and then backtrack for the other things. It does rely on some moments that have been seeded through other issues. For example, Iceman 11 co-stars Richter, who's one of my favorite characters, back introduced in New Mutants and actually introduced, I guess, in X-Factor, and then featured in New Mutants, and then ultimately became a staple of X-Force in the 90s. And he's in this book because there's an offhand comment a few issues ago where he says he's on a break with his boyfriend Shatterstar and that Iceman should drop him a line. And this book opens with like a really funny moment where these two guys are on a date, but it's clearly not a date because both of them are talking about other things, including their recent exes. And so I thought that was like a really genuine moment. A lot of fans were concerned that, you know, that Sina Grace, who himself is an an out gay writer, was just going to kind of play like gay character bingo and like break up this relationship to have Iceman be with him just because those characters are gay and it's convenient. And it winds up being this total other thing where they can strike up a little bit of a friendship and some repartee with two characters who haven't bumped up against each other a lot. And Richter kind of winds up being Iceman's sidekick throughout the issue, which I really enjoyed. It was a chance to see him in a different light than we usually get to see him, and it brought a big smile to my face. So the rest of this issue just features Iceman back in his own neighborhood with his parents because there's some unusual happenings at one of the neighbors' houses, and Iceman goes in to check it out because the parents think, well, that's the neighborly thing to do rather than just call in, you know, the cops or the Avengers or something like that. But interspersed with his investigation of what's going on in the neighbor's home, we also get these flashback scenes to different times in Bobby's life, starting with him being a really little kid before it's totally apparent that he's a mutant, and going all the way through recent issues, including right after his teen version has his coming out moment and the end of Marvel Now. And these flashbacks are kind of drawn to an extent in the style of whatever period they were in. So the very old pre-X-Men 1963 ones are very like plain Sunday comics looking, and then the Jim Lee period one that is from the period of X-Men #3 in 1991 actually has a little bit of like extreme 90s Lee Field look to it. So I have to say that I wound up really coming out enjoying this issue and really feeling like it left Iceman in an interesting place where he is ready to be a contributing member of the X-Men and to be himself. So kudos to Tina Grace and to Robert Gill and the rest of the team. Gill has really emerged from this as a penciler I really enjoy. He's got his flaws, but he really can show action. He also can show emotion on the faces of his characters. And it turns out that like Tina Grace, I think, maybe delivered his best issue of writing and best synergy with the artist, with him inking as well. So maybe he's meant to be involved in the artistic side too if he does more writing for Marvel. But in any event, I think if you've had any interest at all in seeing what this Iceman series is about, rather than feeling like a conclusion, this issue really feels like a summation. And I would say that if you enjoyed this issue, you may enjoy the rest of it, even the issues that I've kind of come out and said, these are not great, because especially the last two issues was a mini arc, just wasn't that good. But I think that this issue is probably the best the series has been other than the Champions arc, and speaks pretty highly for it. So I definitely recommend it if you've been interested in the Iceman series at any point since it debuted in 2017. Next up this week, we have Rogue and Gambit, issue #3 of 5. This issue was written by writer Kelly Thompson, with art by Perry Perez, color art by Frank Dermata, letters from Joe Caramagna, and a cover by Chris Anka. How did we get to this series and what is happening in this series? Well, in short, Rogue has been leading the Unity Squad of Avengers, which is the Avengers team that we see in Uncanny Avengers, for quite some time in All New, All Different Marvel at this point. So she hasn't been as participatory with the X-Men. We've seen her drop in for the biggest happenings. She was there for Inhumans versus X-Men, but she has really ceased being an X-Men character for a little while, and this is the first time we've really seen her back in the fold in the last couple of years. Gambit has definitely been out on the fringes of X. We briefly saw him in X-Men Gold, who's doing a sort of a heist. He's also been in Astonishing X-Men by Charles Soule, but it's not really clear where that fits into the timeline yet, as Rogue is in that too. And it's not obvious if it's before or after this series. So what's going on in this series? Well, Kitty needs mutants to go and look into what's happening in an island that is professing to be a couples retreat, but where some mutants are mysteriously disappearing from the map. And so she figures that the best way to investigate would be send two mutants who could credibly be at a couples retreat getting some counseling, which is Rogue and Gambit, although certainly there are several dysfunctional former couples in the X-Men canon that she could have selected for this mission, especially since it pulls Rogue away from the Avengers, but who am I to quibble with that? So we've got them going to this island and investigating what's going on in this very strange facility, but also having a lot of talks about their relationship, both in the context of psychotherapy and in the context of just the two of them speaking to each other because they're in an enclosed space with each other for the first time in a really long time. Now, Kelly Thompson is one of my favorite authors. I've loved her since she was a columnist at Comic Book Resources. I also have her novels on my shelf. And I'll pretty much buy anything by her. But you heard me say but for a second there and then quickly keep moving. The but is that I don't know that Kelly Thompson is writing the most exciting X-Men series for anybody to just pick up here. She's a longtime X-Men fan, and what this series feels like to me, 3 issues in, is a series that is what everybody accuses X-Men of usually being, which is kind of impenetrable continuity porn. Kelly Thompson last issue referenced a lot of big moments from the Muir Island saga, which is presumably where the first run-in Gambit and Rogue ever had. Here, she's talking about a moment that they shared leading up to the trial of Gambit and Uncanny X-Men 350. And it feels like very much an issue for, like, X-Men insiders, even though it's recapping what happened there and not just saying, oh, remember what happened? Like, it's got an extensive montage to remind you what happened. But as somebody who's not as familiar with that period of X-Men, though I've read it, it just really, like, didn't strongly resonate with me, and I felt like I was just being told about something rather than being shown the difference in Rogue and Gambit's relationship in the present day. And then also, this issue kind of makes sense of why the action in the series has been, like, a little bit jerky. Like, it feels like the characters have kind of forgotten what the plot is, and I criticized that a little bit last time, but it turns out forgetting what the plot is actually kind of part of the plot. But it just emphasizes that this is really almost like a piece of theater with Rogue and Gambit interacting with each other and coming to terms with their relationship with each other, a lot more than it is a slam-bang miniseries plot. I think this issue actually really trades on the artwork from Perez. There's a very kind of complex choreography going on in a particular scene that involves many duplicates of Rogue and Gambit, and that is a tricky thing to draw, and I think he does a really nice job drawing it. And the action, although I had to pause at a couple points, I wasn't pausing because it was unclear, I was pausing because I was lingering over, wow, there's a lot of stuff going on here. So in terms of recommending the series, I think it's really very much a love letter to major fans of Gambit and Rogue over the years. If you're the kind of person who has fond memories of X-Men 24, the issue where they go on their first date with Rogue leaping into Gambit's arms, which I have several copies of myself, I think that this is the series for you. If you're a newer fan, if you like Rogue from the movies, if you don't really have a recollection of a point where they were together, I don't know that this is for you unless you've been like, well, what is this stuff about Gambit and Rogue? Then the series probably explains it to you. But my hope is that Thompson is really going to lead these two characters somewhere where they have, like, a new kind of resolve and a more defined relationships with each other, even if it's not a romantic one, because I think we've played long enough in the uncertainty with these two characters, and so I'm hoping that we can kind of get out of that kind of uncertainty flirting zone and be left with a little bit more resolve. She's got 2 more issues to do it, so I think it's going to happen. So for this one, I really think it's only for major X-Men fans. I can't see at this midpoint recommending it to a newer reader to just pick up, even though it's pretty strong for somebody who is a major X-Men fan. Next up this week, we have the close of the Poison X story featuring X-Men Blue in Venom issue 163. Venom 163 was written by Cullen Bunn, with art by Edgar Salazar and Ario Anandito, inks by Alan Martinez, colors by Dono Sanchez Almada, letters by Clayton Cowles, and a cover by Will Robson and Maury Hollowell. This is the final part of a 5-issue story called Poison X that's been alternating between X-Men Blue and Venom. X-Men Blue, of course, is the team of Teen X-Men I was mentioning earlier in my Iceman review. So what happens is that the team receives a sort of distress call from Corsair, who is Cyclops' father. Corsair leads a group of space pirates, mercenaries, sometimes do-gooders, named the Starjammers, which is a collection of people of all different intergalactic races. And it seems that they've fallen into some trouble that involve the Clintar race, which is the race that the Venom symbiote comes from. The Venom symbiote is the black suit that Spider-Man originally donned in Secret Wars back in the mid-80s, which then eventually finds its way to Eddie Brock to create Venom, although many other people have worn the Venom symbiote over the years, most recently Flash Thompson and another character at the beginning of this Venom series before it kind of crawled back to Eddie Brock. So the X-Men kidnap Venom and bring him into space so that they have somebody with some knowledge of the Clintar. This story, it turns out to be much more of a Venom story than an X-Men story, but it has one major ramification for the X-Men, which I really don't want to spoil here, especially because it's kind of weak sauce as we get to the end of this issue. It's actually something that happened in the issue we saw last week in the X-Men Blue issue, and here it doesn't actually really get developed at all. This issue just feels like it's kind of like ticking off plot points like, let's have a fight, let's get the Starjammers off of this pirate ship, when actually something really major is happening, both for Venom and for the X-Men. I just never really felt the thrill of this major thing happening, which is a big villainous development in Venom's recent history that is going to definitely impact not only him, but also the fate of the Earth, and probably put him in the position to need to be a hero who saves the Earth, which is not something that Eddie Brock typically would be involved in based on his history. So I just felt like weirdly apart from this issue. It contains a potentially big development for the X-Men too, and it just never really rings for me. Also, there are a few moments of like truly weird scripting in here where like there's like weird repetitions of words or like phrases that aren't quite the actual way that phrase is said, or references to things that are not on the page. At one point, Iceman makes like a custom ice tunnel to get people from one ship to another, and Chode of the Starjammer says, "I never fit into these tunnels." What tunnels? The tunnels that Iceman always makes to help you escape? It's just like these little things, and I know that I'm criticizing like single words or two words, but that's the job of a writer and an editor, to work together to clarify these little moments, and I think when they get through in a comic like this, it kind of makes you wince. Like a good comic book doesn't have these little moments of script discontinuity. It felt to me like an indie comic book, like from a small press that didn't get edited very well. It just had that kind of like mopesy, jerky vibe to it. So you know, it got where it needed to get and introduced this big thing for Venom, but I think that any X-Men fan can absolutely skip this Poison X story now that it's over. It does contain a big development for one member of the team that's going to split them up from the team, and it seems like that development is going to get resolved in this upcoming Venomized story that ties into Venom rather than in X-Men Blue, which explains why the X-Men Blue team is not going to be in the next few issues of their own title. It's actually going to shift focus to what's been going on Earth without them, it seems, with a team that features Polaris and Magneto. So this Venom issue, totally not recommended. Even if you've been following this story and you got to the cliffhanger at the end of last week's X-Men Blue, I can just tell you, well, that member actually left the team. Like, you don't really need anything in this issue to keep moving forward. Next this week, we have X-Men Gold issue number 23. X-Men Gold number 23 was written by Mark Guggenheim, with art from Tony Silas, colors from Arif Pranto, letters from Corey Petit, and cover art from David Nakayama. This issue is concerned with the ramifications of the action of Kitty's primary X-Men team in the prior issue. So the setup for that is at the beginning of this series, Kitty Pryde takes over the X-Men as a whole. They'd been hiding out in limbo to avoid the Mpox, which was this disease that X-Men, all mutants really, were getting from the circulating cloud of Terrigen around the Earth that had been released by the Inhumans, which for editorial reasons had suddenly become toxic to mutants. So the school was in limbo because X-Men were safer in a different dimension that was not Earth. But at the resolution of Inhumans versus X-Men, which finally eliminated the cloud, the X-Men could come back. But Storm felt kind of defeated, like she had led the X-Men through a terrible period, terrible to read too. And so she didn't want to be the leader anymore. And so Kitty Pryde, who's one of the youngest members, that's definitely like a permanent X-Men. Like there's no risk of Kitty Pryde getting downgraded to like New Mutants status. She's an X-Men and has been forever. Steps up to be the leader. And that's actually kind of a nice moment. And this book gives us other nice moments about like what is the chain of command in the X-Men right now, right? Like Cyclops is dead, Jean is back, but she's doing her own thing. Wolverine is back, but nobody knows it yet. Storm doesn't want to be the leader, and she's just a regular member of the squad. So who are the leaders other than Kitty? And this gets into that. But anyway, Kitty brings the X-Men school back into smack dab the middle of New York in Central Park, and she decides that it's time to just have a heroic X-Men squad doing heroic things, harkening back to the original intent of the team she was called to join at the beginning of Joss Whedon's astonishing X-Men. But this team tangles with a new brotherhood of evil mutants, but they're not a brotherhood and they're not all evil mutants. They've been assembled by Mesmero on the command of this kind of cable news commentator who has a deep-seated, although perhaps well-founded, hatred and fear of mutants of her own. And in the last issue, this brotherhood is back again, some of them having broken out of prison. The X-Men confront them, but they're tricked by Mesmero into thinking that some of the people they are fighting are a rogues gallery of evil mutants, when in fact they're just a SWAT team who's trying to intercede in the situation. So the X-Men attack a SWAT team, and they wind up arrested, and they decide that they're not going to kind of pull any immunity card or do any kind of psychic trickery. They're just going to go to prison and go through their due process. Now, some people might be like, oh, that's dumb. I'm not going to say that. I actually think it's kind of interesting. It's a different kind of a plot for the X-Men, and I think if you look at this Guggenheim run, that is something that I can credit him with doing. He's trying to do different kinds of plots for the X-Men that are not just the greatest hits of things we've seen before. So he took them to the negative zone. The X-Men haven't done that before. He has the X-Men in prison, and in prison, not in the sense that they've been railroaded into prison because they're there by mistake, but it's not like they're one mutant in this general population prison. They're in a prison that's all for superpowered characters and primarily for mutants. So it feels like a really different kind of story. But here's the thing. Nothing happens. None of these characters really get used for who they are. We see Kitty put into a cell in the opening scenes with Callisto, who Kitty and Storm both have a long and storied history with, but Kitty basically just acts tough. There's no like Kitty Pryde element to her. Later in the prison we get Storm and Rachel walking around in the general population with Kitty, but none of them have any lines that are Storm, Kitty, or Rachel lines. How does Storm feel about being locked up when she was former royalty and doesn't always like enclosed spaces? How does Rachel feel about being locked up when she used to be a hound that chased down mutant prisoners for execution? No comment. Meanwhile, Colossus and Nightcrawler are not locked up in the male portion, and the only thing we really get from them is that they have to be in a brawl because people don't like them because of the X-Men. There's no moments that scream Nightcrawler or Colossus. They're just being brawlers, and they don't have their powers, but Colossus doesn't even make any comment about that either. So it's just like weirdly flat. It's like Guggenheim comes up with these like neat concepts, but then like it doesn't even matter. We could have had 5 other characters entirely in the prison, and none of them would have acted differently other than Kitty having had that past experience with Callisto. The thing that's more interesting to me in this issue is what's going on back at the X-Mansion. So this occurs just after the final issue of Iceman, which we already talked about in this episode, and Iceman comes back to the X-Mansion, and Rogue, who's kind of like pinch hitting as leader without Kitty and Storm there, it basically says to Iceman like, well, you got your wish, you're gonna have to head up a team of X-Men because we have no away team or home team or any team right now. And so Rogue kind of calls up what feels like the next group of X-Men that could get promoted, and it's an interesting group. It's Magic, who's been one of the main X-Men for a while now, but also it's Magma, Armor, Inc. So it's a really actually kind of interesting team that has some potential. And they're not newbies. They're people that Iceman doesn't have a specific experience with necessarily, but they're very seasoned characters. But then that leads us to this like strange Danger Room sequence when Iceman is like trying to decide what to do with this team, and he kind of just turns into like generic leader bot, let's train against Magneto, and it doesn't really have a lot of Iceman elements to it. So again, like really cool cast, cool choices. It's nice to see that like Rogue is the second in command after Kitty, and that there's this team of X-Men who are like ready for prime time at this point, waiting in the wings. And then it's just like a very strange use of them. I know a lot of people are enjoying X-Men Gold, and it seems like, from what I'm hearing, they're enjoying it because of these new plots. And you know what? If you have somebody who's grown very, very tired of the same X-Men plots happening over and over again, of which I count myself one, then yeah, I do think there's some good things for this for you here in this series. But again, it's really hard for me to recommend it when it just feels like so limp and really just not on voice for any of the characters ever. Our final issue this week is X-Men Red #2. This issue is written by Tom Taylor with art from Mahmoud Asrar, color art from Ives Forcina, letters from Corey Petit, and a cover by Travis Charest. X-Men Red is the big re-debut of Jean Grey. She had been dead since Grant Morrison's New X-Men, which ended almost 15 years ago, and so she was brought back by the recent 5-issue Phoenix Resurrection series by Matthew Rosenberg, and now she kind of has a new X-Men team despite herself. She really came back and set out to weigh in on human-mutant relations and be a force for peace. And in doing that and kind of investigating what that means in last issue, she's joined by one old friend, Nightcrawler. By happenstance, she wanders into a situation that also includes Wolverine, who's currently Laura X-23, and her sidekick, Gabby, who's known as Honey Badger. And so that kind of becomes the core of this Jean Grey team. And so she goes to speak at the UN, and it's going over not swimmingly to begin with, although she's being very well spoken. And then something happens outside of the UN that really casts Jean Grey into a different light internationally and puts her on the hated and feared defensive. So that's where we pick up in this issue. And I don't know, I was just a little puzzled by some of the choices here. So one of the things that happened was the big cliffhanger in the last issue introduced a mutant that we know and haven't seen for a while as being one of the string pullers behind the sudden confrontation that Jean has outside of the UN. But in this issue, we don't get a lot of reactions to that. We get a lot of reaction to like Jean, the view of Jean on the world stage, but not like what her plan is to go against this mutant who's a huge risk to the entire Earth. And it feels like weirdly divorced from where we left off in the cliffhanger. Also, the team is out to save a mutant who is a criminal, but who has given Jean a message to say, I think I can help you with this public perception thing. This woman is in prison not because she's a mutant, but because she's done something that is subjectively good, sort of a Robin Hood type thing, but it's objectively in the wrong. So I just think there were a lot of strange choices in the script. It doesn't make it bad. It's not a bad story. The characters actually do sound like themselves and act like themselves, which they don't in X-Men Gold, but it's just like, okay, I think it's kind of got that middle chapter syndrome where it's like, okay, well, maybe when we see how this unfurls, it will make a little bit more sense and seem a little bit more exciting. But the other thing is the art. I just don't feel like Moment Asrar is ready for the big leagues at Marvel, or perhaps he's a bad fit with the other art team things that are happening for him here. I've seen him be great, but his characters are like muddy here. They're gawky. They're weirdly sized. Jean Grey frequently looks like a tiny teenage version of herself that's running around rather than the adult woman that she is. People have like weird wincing kind of sideways faces. It's just like not the artwork that I'd expect from like a big name X-Men title. Maybe it's that Asrar would look better with somebody else inking him because he's having to do too much of the line work on his own, and if he was penciling a little bit looser and had an inker to finish, he would be kind of producing things like the one stunning big spread of Jean kind of psychically being in communication with her team as they break into this prison. That was one of the best looking spreads in this book. And if the art quality was that high throughout, I would be more into it. Maybe the colors are just not making his characters pop quite the way that they should, but it's another issue where the art was like not just average for me, but like verging on something that I found unpleasant to read. So it's a shame because I think I'm really excited for Jean to be back. I think Tom Taylor is a really great, exciting writer, has been doing awesome things on All New Wolverine, but this issue to me just kind of felt a little like, oof. So I'm hoping that things are going to come together a little bit now that this prison break action is through, and now that we're seeing some conflict that has given us another cliffhanger, and I remain optimistic. But the other thing is that it just is going to feel like X-Men Red is developing slowly, with X-Men Blue and X-Men Gold double shipping. Their stories just come out so quickly, and we get through arcs in the span of like 2 months, because a 4-issue arc, 2 a month, 2 months finish an arc. And X-Men Red, it's going to take us months to get through an arc, and I just think it's weird to put one X-Men team title on such different footing than the other two, because it's just going to feel like almost remedially slow. Also, I must say, I do love Travis Charest, the cover artist. He was a penciler of Wildcats back in the day, and we all know I love my vintage Wildstorm. But what is going on with this cover? Nightcrawler with a big beard, and he's like standing on a weird like stone structure. It has nothing to do with what's going on in the issue. It's not even on model for Nightcrawler in this issue. What the hell? I'm fine with covers by alternate pencilers that have nothing to do with the interior art, although I don't really get it, but like fine, make the cover look good. But can we get the cover to be like somewhat related to the character model that's inside of the book? It just made me laugh so hard. I think it's a brilliant cover. It's gorgeous. And then I opened the book and I was like, this is not the Nightcrawler that's inside this issue. So that was also kind of a strange thing about this issue for me. That is it for this week in X. Next week in X is going to be a big week. We've got new issues of All New Wolverine, Astonishing X-Men, the new New Mutants miniseries called Dead Souls, Old Man Logan, Weapon X, and X-Men Blue. A huge week in X. So thank you so much for watching This Week in X from Crushing Comics.